Dr. Demarais, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here, Cable.
My pleasure. So you are, or actually were, recently retired. You were the Mississippi State Deer Lab co-director and the Taylor Chair in Applied Big Game Research and Instruction. We'll talk about that in a second. So, are you originally from Mississippi?
No, I'm originally from Massachusetts. Grew up, hunting and fishing, and decided I wanted to be a wildlife biologist when I went off to college, and that led me to graduate school at Mississippi State. Got my PhD there, and then came to Texas for 15 years. Worked at Texas A&M Kingsville. That was my first job, and then I went up to Lubbock and was a Red Raider for 13 years, and did big game research at both places.
Okay.
Big game here in Texas, as you know, is pretty varied. So,
Yeah.
if it had hooves and antlers, I pretty much worked with it. And then I
Uh-huh.
went to Mississippi for 27 years and mostly focused on whitetails, did a little elk and, a few other habitat related things. But I was basically been a deer ecologist my whole life, and it's been a wonderful blessing for me.
Uh-huh. That's okay. So you spent a good stretch at Texas Tech, and that's mule deer country out there.
Yes, I had mostly worked with whitetails in South Texas and in the hill country, and the exotic and whitetail interactions in the hill country. Had one big project. We looked at mortality rates and movement of mule deer out on Elephant Mountain Wildlife Management Area out near Alpine.
Uh-huh.
So
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
covered a
I
range of species, and I spent a lot of time driving in pickup trucks when I was here for those
uh-huh.
15 years.
Yeah. I just got a new lease up around Childress and we have whitetail and mule deer on it.
Okay, nice.
Yeah. So
You
we'll
can you
see.
can
Should be
l-
interesting.
search for those behavioral interactions.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going this weekend to put out my first round of trail cameras, start seeing what we have, but certainly excited about that.
Yeah.
So what was something interesting that you discovered when you were working with the exotics and the whitetails and their interactions? And I'll give you an example. One of my buddies has a high fence place, and he kept he found like three different whitetail bucks just dead in his front pasture, and they had little
Hmm.
pinholes in them. And he was like, "Dang, somebody is poaching my deer." Like he'd find them. They've been dead for a couple of days, but he's like, "There's a hole in them. It looks like somebody shot them." Well, he's sitting in a blind, just videoing some bucks, and he has this black buck that has very long curl, three or four curls. I don't know, mature black buck. And he sees this black buck run up to a whitetail and just poke a hole in him broadside.
Huh.
And he was like, "Oh, that
Yeah.
this black buck, that was I think the fourth one. It killed that one too.
Wow.
He just gores them. You wouldn't think that a 80, 90 pound black buck would have the balls to go, stab a 200-pound whitetail buck, but there he was doing it, and it became like a repetitive thing.
Yeah. Well, the black buck are really, really territorial. You find these big piles of poop, black buck poop,
Mm.
identifying a buck's territory, and he defends it even against other species, apparently.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So
So, so what were some interesting things that you found?
we were looking more at the foraging interactions, dietary overlap. Because a lot of people think, well, do I've got whitetails and I want more stuff, and they throw in
Axis
some
deer.
axis deer and some fallow deer and some sika deer, and oh, let's bring in some antelope and black buck antelope and you know gemsbok and you name it. They like to throw stuff in. Texans love variety,
Yeah.
and it's the problem from a management standpoint is all those species are herbivores. They eat plants, and some of them differ in the types of plants, and they're even um, made differently anatomically to allow them to eat certain types of plants. Like whitetails are concentrate selectors, it's called, and they're designed or their GI tract requires that they eat highly digestible forages like forbs,
Hmm.
and they cannot essentially digest grasses very well at all. They eat forbs and browse, broadleaf brush species. And that's what they do. And they do it really well. And they have
What about winter
anatomical,
wheat though?
well, yeah. Yeah, I'm talking about natural plants. Yeah, they'll eat
Yeah.
fertilized, agronomic plantings that are not their normal diet, but it's the
Uh-huh.
winter wheat is highly digestible. It has good
Yeah.
protein. It's more digestible than your typical native grasses.
Yeah. So, and I asked you that because this other place I have has a coastal Bermuda field and also has winter wheat. The
Mhm.
deer don't seem to like the coastal Bermuda.
Yeah, I would
They love the
expect
wheat.
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
when it's growing actively, it's much more digestible and more higher protein than that coastal. That's well, and typically the coastal I don't think is growing at the same time the wheat is, and
Hmm.
there's not a lot of other green things growing when the winter wheat is growing in that cool season. And so it's not that they just love winter wheat; it's they're going for the most digestible, best quality stuff that's available, and you've provided them
Hmm.
that with the winter wheat. That's not it doesn't mean that they love winter wheat. Provide them something
Yeah.
more of a broadleaf weed type, like a soybean or uh, any variety of that type of forage. They're going to prefer that over the winter wheat.
Uh-huh. Okay. Uh-huh. And so going back to those differences, like so an axis deer, for example, I'd say
Yeah,
that's probably the first thing someone is going to put on their place. Like I got
yeah.
whitetail, I want to hunt throughout the spring and summer. All right, here's my axis deer. They do very well in Texas, obviously. And so, what are the differences
Think
in the
about
forage?
foraging adaptations as a kind of continuum with white-tailed deer on the far side of the spectrum at concentrate selectors. They need highly digestible forages. And then on the other end of the spectrum are cattle, the domestic cattle. They eat grass and they're
Mm-hmm.
really good at eating and digesting and getting the most out of grass. And then everything else is kind of in between. Axis are what we call intermediate feeders. And most of the exotic deer species are intermediate feeders. They will they can eat a range of things. They can eat the grass, they can eat the most highly digestible forages, and they can do well across a range of those things. And probably the most uh, damaging exotic deer you could put on with whitetails is Sika deer. Uh,
Okay.
there was a study many years ago at Kerr Wildlife Management Area where they put in I think they were like roughly 80-acre enclosures, and they put a 6 or 7 Sika deer and 6 or 7 whitetail deer, does and bucks, in each in an enclosure, and they monitored them over I think an 8-year period. At the end of 8 years, there was something like 70 over 70 Sika deer, and there was zero whitetail deer still alive.
Wow. Okay.
The
Huh.
Sika just were able to eat whatever was growing, even stuff that wasn't growing. The whitetails are more restricted because they're concentrate selectors. So
Mm-hmm.
species like Sika deer is tremendously competitive with whitetails. Axis deer are they're still an intermediate feeder, but they're not quite as competitive. They will compete directly with whitetails. They eat grass. They also eat browse and forbs. And one of the studies we did was looking at 2 years of environmental weather patterns. In a drought year, the overlap was greater among the axis, fallow, whitetails, and Sika. During a drought year, they were much more competitive, and during a wet year, they were able to kind of each address their individual desires. So
Mm-hmm.
it's all about weather and the available forage. Like we're talking about that winter wheat. Whitetails don't just love winter wheat, but that's the best stuff at the time. They're going to eat it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Mm-hmm.
all about
Yeah.
availability of forage. So you don't just throw a bunch of axis and fallow and Sika deer and think, oh, they're not competing with whitetails, because they are.
Yeah.
They are. And
Mm.
even if you have feeders, you think, well, I don't have any nutritional limitations. I have full ration feed available ad libitum whenever they want it. Well, I remember I was doing a spotlight count with my graduate students, and I saw a whitetail and a Sika buck come up to each other. they locked antlers, and the sea just flipped the whitetail on its side, and the whitetail jumped up and ran off. You know,
Yeah.
that's what happens when there's a forage, a localized forage at a feeder. You know, you have a bunch of species, and they're not all going to get the same amount.
Hmm.
So it's
Well,
a
and you
comp.
see these other species, like I've seen axis deer and fallow deer run whitetail off feeders. You know,
Mm-hmm.
the whitetail will just hang out on the perimeter until they're done feeding, and then they'll come in. They don't want to interact with them.
Yeah,
If it's
yeah,
just does, you know, you'll see whitetail and axis does that they don't seem to bother each other. But when there's a buck in there, a
yeah.
whitetail buck's not going to come in there with a mature axis buck dominating that feeder.
Mm-hmm.
So
And you
you know,
see the same thing within whitetails. The buck dominated feeder, the does will wait for the adult bucks to leave.
yeah,
So,
which is
not,
interesting, right?
yeah,
They're the
it's
same
all
species, but they
about
don't want to be
dominance.
there. Yeah, yeah. Um, okay, so that's cool. I didn't realize you had such a history with Texas as well. Um, here's a question for you. So you've been doing this for a very long time. Um, how I want to know how things have changed because I believe that we are one of our biggest um, detrimental factors for the future of hunting is that we have folks pursuing degrees in wildlife management that aren't hunters, that don't fish. It's they're coming at it from I just love wildlife. I love
Mm-hmm.
animals.
Yep.
Have
Ranger
you
Rick
seen
types.
yeah, have you seen a trend? Have you seen can you validate that my opinion is reality? Like over the course of your career, do we see more young people pursuing degrees that you know in your field that don't hunt?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That was a growing trend, increasing percentage of our student body at Mississippi State, also at Texas Tech, although it was, early in that trend when I was at Texas Tech. But yeah, it's happened much faster in most states. Mississippi and Texas to an extent are more conservative,
Yeah.
land management based states. But we still at Mississippi State, we had students coming in that were, they had no connection with the land. They didn't understand why you'd want to hunt. Uh, but we also still had our core. We're an applied management program, hook and bullets, and we still had those kind of kids coming in to educate, to learn from us. We
Mm-hmm.
had I was the deer ecologist in an endowed chair, which meant you know my job was to do applied deer research. We have a duck guy at Mississippi State. We have a quail and turkey guy at Mississippi State, all in endowed chairs, and that's to ensure the future that as things continue to change in society, Mississippi State will always have a faculty member that messes with deer and
Mm-hmm.
messes with ducks and messes with game birds. So
Mm. Okay.
real valid concern, Cable.
Mm.
I appreciate your perspective. I don't think it's society is changing. And
Right.
I wouldn't say that, I forget exactly how you worded it, but I wouldn't call it a threat to hunting necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
that there are more kids coming into wildlife biology that don't understand the management side from a hunting standpoint, consumptive management.
Mm-hmm.
As long as we still have our base of kids coming through that do hunt and fish and can go into the state agencies with that perspective, then I think we'll be okay. But it's getting harder for the state agencies to find the kind of young professionals that they want in these positions.
Mm-hmm. Did you did you ever see folks come in that weren't hunters that would go through the coursework, the program, and come out of it like, hey, I want to go hunting, like maybe change
Yeah.
their perspective?
Yes, they understand the ecology behind hunting.
Uh-huh.
They just saw a killing. They grew up watching Bambi. Many of us
Right.
did, and that's shows hunters as bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're not bad guys, we're playing a significant role in conservation, provided monetary support and and population regulation to some extent. Never enough in the deer world can we get hunters to harvest enough deer. That's been an issue for 30 years, and uh, We can't get, the agencies try to get more deer harvested. They lengthened seasons. They expanded the number of types of seasons. They liberalized what kind of weapons you can use in different seasons. Um,
Yeah. I mean,
and
that's the impetus of our MLD program in Texas. Like, kill more deer.
yes, yes, and MLD is different. But let me make my point about the state agency approaches
Yeah.
in less intensively managed states. They try to get more deer harvested, but the average successful hunter in Mississippi shoots 1.5 deer. And I
Mm.
know the same number applies to many other states. They're successful deer hunters. Give them more time, they're not going to kill more deer. Increase the bag limit, they're not going to kill more deer. And the pressures of alternative activities with families and soccer and all these things
Yeah.
that kids are doing now,
I've got
it
three of them in club soccer. I know.
yeah, there's less and less time to for you to go hunting, and also for you to train them up to love and appreciate the role of hunting. So
Mhm.
it's a tough situation.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. 1.5. So, yeah, you can increase the season length. They get their one deer or two deer and they're like, I'm good for the season. I got meat in the
Yeah,
freezer. They
yeah.
don't really feel like the pressure to go shoot more deer. Uh, yeah, it's interesting, but makes sense. Huh. Um, I think, but going back to that question about these young people, and we saw this with Deb Howland, who was our former Secretary of Interior. SCI straight up said, will you commit to a no net loss policy when it comes to hunting? And she was like, she wouldn't do it. And then we saw her close millions of acres in Alaska of public land for no reason. No science behind it, which I'm off. If science says we need to protect this species in this region, I'm like, okay, fine, let's do that. But this decision was void of that. Um, and that's a preservation ideology, which isn't conservation. It's basically let God sort it out. It doesn't work when there's 330 million people in this country and these animals are existing in limited habitat areas. They're
Hmm.
so that's kind of, I think these young people that don't hunt are just coming at it with this preservation. Like, no, we don't need
There are,
hunting,
yeah, yeah,
you know.
there are.
But then
And
you
back to
take
the
out the hunter and then you take out sustainable use management, and that's not conservation at all.
and back to the Texas approach with the managed land deer permit. That allows a ranch hand to basically shoot all the deer that they can during the hunting
Yeah,
season. And so
becomes his
it
job.
removes, yeah, it removes the need to get recreational hunters onto the property and deal with you know the vagaries of recreational hunters. Now here's my one of my problems with the changes over the last 30 years is hunters and their behaviors. They now think they have to have gadgets, and the average hunter has goes and sits in a stand that's in the same place it's always been, and there's a feeder 100 yards away, and it spins at 4 o'clock and 4:30 and 7:30 in the morning, and that's how they hunt. They don't know how to go out and find deer and go where the deer are. And if they are hunting these same stands over and over again, and they're not seeing deer that they think they should see, they blame biologists or the manager of that property. Well, you've messed up the deer population. No, you've become a lazy hunter and you don't know how to go out and find the deer that are there. They're there.
Mm-hmm.
They're just not being seen.
Mm-hmm.
We've done a lot of research in recent years, well, before I retired at Mississippi State, looking at deer behavior and movements and habitat selection. We also documented where the hunters were. This was about a 55,000 acre private land mass with about 30 different landowners. All the landowners identified where the hunters were hunting and when. And we looked at habitat selection of the deer and of the hunters. And they were almost the mirror image, the opposite. Where the hunters were, the deer weren't. Where the deer were, the hunters weren't going.
Hmm.
And now, some of the cases, the deer would go where the hunters were, but only at night. So it's a zero sum game for the hunters. If they don't learn how to find the deer and know where to go and to hunt, then it's those hunters, well, boy, I may get myself in trouble with you and your listeners, but I would argue that the lazy hunter is as bad for the future of hunting as the kids you were talking about coming out without any hunting experience.
Mm.
We have to
Yeah.
get back to our basics and understand the ecology of the animals if we're going to be successful harvesters.
Mm. Well, certainly, and certainly even more so when it comes to mature bucks. I think one of the hardest, the most frustrating whitetail seasons I ever had. So I live in there's 4 counties in Texas that are archery only, all in North Texas, and
Mhm.
we have what I believe are some Midwest genetics, and people kill 200-inch deer in these counties every year.
Mhm.
Well, okay, because they're not. It's all developed. I live on the suburbs of. I live in McKinney, so 20 miles north of Dallas, and we keep seeing urban sprawl keep going north and keep going north. So our habitat has become limited, and actually, other than Grayson County, which is the north of me, Rockwall, Dallas, and Collin counties didn't even have deer seasons until I think it was 2013, maybe that we had our first season since the 1970s. So deer were coming back. We have these nice genetics, and then of course the deer get old because you can only kill them with a bow.
Mhm.
Um,
And they
um,
get big antlers.
yeah, but so at least 20 acres that was 15 minutes from my house. I won't tell you how much that cost me because my wife would kill me. But there was a 180-inch buck that was coming onto that property,
Uh-huh.
but never when I was there. 20 acres
Yeah.
is a small place.
Yeah,
And
sure
he would never
is.
come to a feeder either. I only got pictures of him in they had a city pipeline where they could come in and manage stuff there. I get photos of him there or on trails.
Mhm.
Never, not one that entire season, not one photo at a feeder. And it just goes to show you, like, these deer are smart, and
Yes.
especially the mature ones. And I think in these urban settings, a lot of these deer, they associate a feeder with human
Mhm.
presence.
Yeah.
And those big bucks are like, nope, not interested in that. I'll walk on the perimeter, see if there's does there, but I'm not going anywhere near that thing.
Mhm. Yeah. So, to improve your chances for him, you got to put up a climbing stand in a tree on a trail.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Which I did, but he still
yeah.
he figured me out. It's 20 acres was small, man.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was a fun season, but he figured me out pretty quick.
Well, maybe he'll
Um,
live to next year and he'll be a 185.
well, I got off that place. It was too expensive, and
Uh,
the neighbors had 3 labs down the road that were always getting
oh.
out. And I would have a picture of him at a mock scrape, and then 2 minutes later I'd have a picture of those labs, and he's gone. And like, deer's not going to put up with that. He's not going to
No.
hang out with these dogs running around. But anyway, I came across why I initially reached out to you was I came across just a clip on social media that you were discussing whitetail breeding and specifically some fascinating information on gestation. Um, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that a whitetail doe that is pregnant with twins might actually be carrying the offspring of 2 different bucks.
Yes. Yes. And
My,
that was
my
something
mind was blown.
yeah, multiple paternity, we call it.
Uh-huh.
And, twins in whitetails are not identical twins. They're two separate eggs. And so if the doe breeds with more than one buck, it could easily be shared parentage.
Huh.
And that work was done with Randy DeYoung, who was working with me on his PhD at the time. He's now at Texas A&M Kingsville as a geneticist and a deer ecologist there. And in his study, we looked at in our research pens where we had 2 to 3 bucks with 10 does in different pens, and we were looking at the relationship between dominance and breeding success. We had antlers cut off, just dominance and body mass, and what affected which bucks were breeding and age. And we found that 50% of the success of the buck was tied to his body size, but 50% had nothing to do, and the age wasn't as critical as body size. It was just a big body that could push the others around.
Hmm.
And we had a range of ages and all, but so we we're interested in that. But in the process, we started looking at the offspring and matching them back to the fathers. And we found that about 1 in 4 sets of twins were sired by different bucks. Even when there was a clear dominant buck in the pen, 1 out of 4 of the does had at least one other sire.
Oh, wow.
And then we looked at 3 other properties in a wild population in Mississippi, a wild population that was enclosed, 3,000-acre property in Oklahoma in cooperation with the Noble Foundation. And then we looked at the King Ranch, which is a free range population. And in those 3 properties, we found again about 1 in 4 sets of twins are sired by different bucks.
So the percentage didn't change whether it was captivity or free range.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. That's
Yeah,
fascinating.
that blew my mind. I thought, well, certainly it's different because you always worry about in a research facility, is that really what's happening? And the
Yeah.
number was the same within one
So,
percentage point.
huh. Well, I do want to ask you this though. So you're saying that body size, body mass determine dominance. If you cut the buck's headgear off, is that still an accurate, like, do you still know who's really dominant if
Yeah,
you
we had observers out there watching them, and so we
uh-huh.
could tell who was dominant, who was subordinate, and who was in
But would that
case
have
of 3 there
changed
was
if
a
they
one,
had
two, three,
if they had antlers? Would that have changed at all?
possibly.
Huh.
We were interested in, well, we can't leave the antlers on in the pens like that. They'd kill each other.
Right. Sure.
Uh,
100%.
and but then we also looked at breeding success of bucks in the 3,000-acre fenced property in Oklahoma, long-term, about 10 years worth of data. And we looked at, we had data on about half of the fawns produced over that 10-year period in the property. Not every fawn, but half of them, which is a sample
Mm-hmm.
of 500 fawns produced over 10 years. And it was the Noble Foundation study area. And my colleague, I got to put a shout out to Ken G, who worked for the Noble Foundation as a wildlife biologist. But we
Where
found
is
that
that? Where is that? Is that close to Atoka?
it was in not Ardmore, Allen, Oklahoma. I think it
Okay,
was
yeah.
Allen.
I know of the Noble Foundation. I used to have a lease in Atoka County, and I'm pretty sure their property was somewhere around there anyway.
Their
But okay, so
headquarters, their headquarters is in Ardmore,
yeah, yeah.
and they have properties that they do research and extension
Mhm,
on.
mhm.
So
So
uh, we looked at the antler size of successful sires and how many fawns were produced by individual sires. And in any given year, uh, roughly a third of all the bucks were involved in breeding. But that's a lot of bucks on 3,000 acres. Uh, and if you look at the lifetime success rate of producing fawns, we looked at 6-month-old fawns. We didn't look at their birth because we weren't able to
mhm,
get hands on birth date, but we had
mhm,
6-month-old fawns, which meant they survived. The
right.
60% of the bucks on the property that were successful only produced 1 fawn to recruitment.
Hmm,
Now,
hmm.
you could double that because we only had half of the fawns, half of the population. So 2 fawns. The average buck produced 2 fawns in their lifetime. We
That's
had
it
some, yeah,
in
that's
their
it,
lifetime.
their lifetime.
Because you said okay, so you said 1/3 of the bucks were involved in breeding each season.
In any given year. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Uh,
And that would mean that so maybe, I don't know, 4, 5, 6-year-old deer are involved.
yes,
And
yeah. 50 to 60% of the breeding was done by 3.5 and older bucks.
huh.
Up to 70%. We had different sex ratios. Again, we're in the King Ranch, we're at the Noble Foundation, and we were in a public area in Mississippi. And
Mhm.
regardless, the greatly different sex ratios and age structure of the bucks and the harvest approach to bucks. But in all 3 properties, and these are wild hunted properties, all 3 properties, roughly 30% of the breeding was done by 1.5 and 2.5-year-old bucks. Even though, like on the King Ranch, is dominant, their harvest strategy is a buck per 1,000 acres, and they have to be 6 or older. So
Yeah.
you have a lot of older and middle-aged bucks on that property that don't get to breed. So then we
Hmm.
also looked at antler size. And you think, well, obviously the biggest antlered buck's going to be most dominant, because why else would they have antlers? It's got to help their breeding success.
Hmm.
Yeah, not much. Uh, we had, for example, a really nice, probably a 140, 150 class buck in Oklahoma that he bred. Uh, he produced maybe 5 or 6 fawns over a 3-year period. He didn't breed
Wow.
before that. He didn't breed after that. Then we
He was
had
getting after it.
another buck that was bred produced a fawn every year for 8 years,
Hmm.
and he was just a little 8 point. Never big antlered, but he was
He was
steady.
sneaky.
He was there every year waiting.
Yeah.
Uh, and
So
that's
these,
what
but these are outliers because these bucks way overshot the two in a lifetime
Yes,
number.
yes, absolutely.
Oh.
The average, the 60% of the bucks only had one fawn. The 40% had that were successful had more than one fawn. So there
Hmm.
were the biggest success rate was 12 fawns produced by one buck.
Hmm.
And so maybe 24 fawns. Now he's a great breeder, great breeding success,
Hmm.
but he didn't have any particularly great antlers. He was a 9 point. Uh,
So does that
so
mean
the
that deer is sneaky and like waits for his opportunity, or that his body size? You said his antlers weren't great. Maybe he was a massive, had massive body and was dominant in that way. But when you think about
yeah,
a 1.5 or 2.5 year old deer being responsible for whatever 30% of the breeding or whatever it was you
yeah,
said,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
these bucks are not running other deer off. They're just waiting for a moment and they're sneaking in.
Exactly, exactly. And when they typically, we looked at the breeding success by age through the breeding season, and the yearling bucks in particular were only successfully inseminating does during the several weeks of the peak breeding. They weren't
Hmm.
able to compete when there was 10 bucks chasing one doe. The yearling wasn't getting in there.
Hmm.
But when there's 2 bucks watching a doe, and I actually this happened in our research pens. We were out there and I saw it. We had 3 bucks in a pen, and we were trying to dart a doe, and so we were moving the deer around, and uh, the 2 older bucks started fighting, and the yearling buck that was in there slipped up and bred the doe. I saw him breeding that doe while the 2 older, bigger antlered bucks, well, they didn't have antlers at the time, but the 2 older, more dominant bucks were fighting. So,
Hmm.
it's sneaky and persistent. I like that successful small antlered 8 point. I like to call him a really good dancer. He was there
Hmm.
all the time waiting. Maybe he was a good dancer, so he got some interactions, and finally, every year he was throwing out a successful reproductive event.
Hmm. I shot a pronghorn one time in the Texas Panhandle. He was out in a wheat field with, I think he had 3 or 4 does with him. And I shoot him and he drops. And this is flat, just ag country. I didn't even
Mm-hmm.
know there was a tree anywhere near. So he drops, the does run off, and I'll be danged if another buck didn't immediately hop up and run down those does and join them. And
Yeah,
he was under this. There was one tree there. Nobody saw
yeah,
this buck. He was just hanging out, waiting
yeah.
for his moment. I did him a
Mm-hmm.
favor. I took out his competition, and then he's like, "Whoop, hey ladies, like here I am."
Yeah, yeah.
So,
And I've
uh,
heard stories of somebody shooting the dominant bull with a bunch of cows, and the subordinate buck runs up while the bull is on the ground, gores them just to have his 2 cents, and then runs
yeah,
off with the
yeah,
cows.
yeah. Well, you see it all the time with. I don't know why turkeys do it, but they always seem to want to fight their dead friend. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
y- but let's see. I was going to ask you. So I'm the father of identical twins. I think they're both mine, right? Uh, you would think. Are identical twins common in
No,
in cervids? No. Okay.
no, not at all.
Huh. Interesting. And do other species, to your knowledge, share whatever this phenomenon is, where you can have two different suitors, both with a fertilized egg in the same doe? Is that something that's unique to cervids, or is that common in other species?
Good question, Cable. I don't haven't reviewed that literature in a while, and I'm not sure.
Okay, I just was wondering. Um, hmm. Yeah. So, oh man, it's very interesting, because I always thought, like, when I think of whitetail breeding, I think you have a doe in estrus, the dominant buck hangs out with her for a day or two or whatever it is. They breed, and then she's done.
Hmm.
But this says no, she's not.
Well, she's going to be bred during that 36-hour period. That's her fertility period.
Uh huh.
So it's not like, well,
Okay.
generally that she's done. Now, some does don't take, the eggs don't take, so they recycle 28 days later. But
Right.
assuming she's successfully implants, she's done after 36 or 40 hours. But during
Okay.
that time period, you know, and this is characteristic of a lot of species of males. One that I'm personally familiar with, species called humans, and it applies to whitetails as well. Uh, After you breed, you know, well, ask your wife, what do you do after a successful romantic encounter? You either fall asleep or you go get something to eat.
Right.
Uh, so
Last
I
night
don't
it was
know.
ice cream, I think.
Yeah. Oh, so when a buck has this interaction, he's he's lost it for a little bit. He has a period of he's not going to be too excited about doing it again.
Yeah.
And again, in our research pens, I personally saw the dominant buck breed a doe, and then the next dominant buck came right back 2 minutes later and bred her again because the
Huh.
dominant buck was his off smoking a cigarette.
Right. Right. Okay.
Not that. No, I'm not
Interesting.
promoting cigarettes here. I mean, just the old
Right.
joke about uh,
Yeah.
have sex and you got to have a cigarette.
Sure.
That's like my generational joke. So
Yeah.
sorry, I'm old.
No. Um. Well, like I said, when I saw that clip, I was like, "This is interesting." Like, I never. Well, what I just described, I just figured it's the buck. He goes off into the thicket with his gal, and
Hmm.
then that's that.
Yep.
But
One of
no,
one of
she's receptive to other bucks. I guess just biologically, she's like, well, that's what nature's telling her to do.
Absolutely. Now we did another study that had no practical application, but we were able to do it because we were needing to control the breeding dates of does to document fetal aging criteria for how to estimate how old is the fetus. And so we had all these does that we were synchronizing their estrus and then putting them in with a buck to
Mm.
breed. And during the 24 hours prior to putting her in with the buck, we were actually able to look at female choice because it really should matter which buck is breeding her because she's investing the next 200 days and then the 4 months after that lactating and another 6 months or 8 months helping them survive. So it's a huge investment for a doe. It should matter. uh, so we looked at, all right, is it antler size, age, or uh, body size, mass? And we looked at each of those separately because people have
As
historically
far as what's appealing to a doe,
what's appealing to a
what
doe.
nature's telling her to breed with.
Yes, very
Uh-huh.
limited studies in the past with red deer in particular had shown, the does tend to want to be with a mature buck. They
Mm.
tend to go to a mature buck over a yearling or 2-year-old buck, bull, and red deer.
Hmm.
But a mature buck is also bigger antlered and older, and bigger antlered, bigger bodied, and older. So, which of those three things is the key selection criteria for her, or is it all three? Nobody had ever
Hmm.
looked at that individually to control for the other two factors. So we did a really cool study over a couple of years with a really great graduate student, Dan Marina, and showed that does did not choose for body size. They did not choose for age. They only chose for antler size.
Really?
Yes.
Huh.
Which makes sense because antlers are thought of ecologically as a an indicator of genetic superiority or of survival. If a buck, a doe should want to have a successful sire
Hmm.
for her offspring. It's in her best interest to have a successful sire. And so, in theory, we were expecting older bucks to be chosen over younger bucks because if an older buck is still alive, he's successful enough to live. And if he's
Right.
bigger, he's successful at getting food and potentially being more dominant. And if he has bigger antlers, that's again an indicator of his success. So we thought maybe all three of those things would play a role, but it was only the antler size in our study that mattered to we did it to dozens of does in very controlled circumstances.
Hmm. Wow.
But
Okay.
that was like a blew our minds that it was just
Yeah.
antlers.
But in the wild, like sometimes she doesn't get to pick because
That's
the
right.
the 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 bigger, older, more mature buck might not have his, say you've got a 6.5-year-old 8 point and you've got a
Mm-hmm.
3.5-year-old beautiful 10 point. And but that the 6.5-year-old's gonna run him off just based off how much bigger he is,
Yep.
and maybe his attitude.
Yep.
And then the does, she's not gonna, maybe that 10 point comes in after he's done, and then he's responsible for the other
Mm-hmm.
fertilized egg. I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah. Great questions, and we thought about that, and we would have loved to have test how a female might actually implement her choice once she's bred. If she's bred by a couple different bucks, does she somehow affect the success of those sperm? But we never got to chase that rabbit. Um,
Hmm.
it was interesting. It's an interesting ecological question. We showed that they like big antlers.
Hmm. Yeah, well, it's just like dudes. We like big boobs and big bass and we like big rack bucks too. Like, I mean, that's just
Yeah.
biological. It's like how we're wired.
Yep. Yeah. And
Yeah.
your wife probably chose to marry you because you were a big guy.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm big. I'm bigger now than I was then. That's for sure. Uh, yeah. Well,
So
interesting
well,
stuff there.
I'm rambling so much here because there's so many cool things that I've been blessed with to be able to
I'm just soaking it
research.
all in. So keep rambling.
Well, uh, so we did the breeding success. We looked at timing of breeding by the does. There's lots of
Uh-huh.
theories out there in popular literature. It's the moon phase that, it's the harvest moon after the fall equinox that does are going to breed 7 to 10 days after that. That was really popular about 15, 20 years ago. A lot of deer magazines were talking about the moon effect. We tested that. Absolutely no moon effect on timing of breeding. And in that case, I didn't expect there to be because the timing of the breeding is controlled by the doe's hormonal cycle, which is a months long process of preparation. She doesn't just uh, ovulate because, oh, the full moon was 7 days ago, so I'm going to ovulate now.
Mm.
They have a very strongly controlled physiological cycle that determines when a doe is going to breed. And it's not due to moon phase. We looked at temperature. It's not due to
I believe
temperature.
that. I believe that 100% because if you are on a property for an extended period of time, me, I lease, right?
Mm-hmm.
The rut seems to always be at the same time, regardless of the moon phase. Now, we as hunters don't like a new moon, a full moon, right? Like
Yep. Yep.
that sucks because then they're up breeding at night. And I do believe that to be true.
Yep.
Like we don't like it. I
Yep.
see less deer when there's a full moon. I just do.
Yep. Uh,
Some studies
and
say that's a bunch of hogwash, but I believe it to be true.
one of the fun things in research is finding out things that are different from what you thought. And I also have always enjoyed educating hunters and landowners that have this a belief, like they believed in the moon phase, or they believe
Mm.
in temperature starting the rut. uh, Absolutely no effect of temperature on the breeding activity of a doe. Cold snap will increase the movement behavior of the deer population in general, so you're going to see more deer. That doesn't mean that the does are all of a sudden going to breed.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely no effect. Now, the moon phase, I clap my hands when you talked about the moon, because I've always believed, and I know a lot of deer biologists, we worked our deer spotlight counts around the full moon, because just general experience, when it was a full moon, we didn't see deer at night on spotlight
Mm.
lines. So the idea, hunters say, well, they're active at night because there's so much light. No, not based on our observation during nighttime spotlight counts and special collections. We would avoid that time period because we wouldn't see them. Uh, so what we did, another analysis with our big movement data set, we looked at how moon phase affects deer movement. And dang it, I was wrong in that case. Moon phase, we could show no signal with moon phase affecting the total movement rate through the day or the hourly movement rate of bucks. It's nothing there.
Really?
Yeah. Now,
So that's just my own personal opinion that is probably incorrect then. It's in my
well,
head. The moon
I
doesn't
still,
affect it.
I still believe what I believe, uh, even though it's a conundrum, I guess is the right word for me.
So you believe it too, though.
Yes, I saw it. It's real. But what we oftentimes do, Cable, as hunters, you see, how many breeding events have you seen on your properties or over your adult
Quite a
life
few.
hunting?
I don't know how many, but quite a few.
Yeah.
Yeah,
6, 7.
probably somewhere in
Yeah.
that.
I had a database that I would use to teach this topic with for my when we did deer workshops. I had a database of 147 known birth dates, breeding dates for does on a property. Those
Mhm.
does were sampled annually over about a 10 or 15 year period. So the 10 does at a time. And depending upon which 10 does you picked out of that population on a given year, the breeding date shifted as much as 20 days from year to
Mm.
year. But it doesn't. The breeding date centers and has a total of 45 days. 90% or more of the does are bred within 45 days. It doesn't change
Mm.
from year to year. But what I'm getting at here is sample size. With 10 samples, it wasn't adequate to tell me from the data when the breeding of the population was. It was just a small sample. So for hunters that might, see 6 or 7 does being bred, oh, that's a huge sample. Yes, it's amazing. But it doesn't tell you what's really happening biologically on that property. It's too small of a sample. You might have seen those over several years,
Mhm.
and different properties. It's hunters think we know what we think we know, but we don't necessarily know what reality is. And again, I'm guilty of it too.
But reality is, if you are on the same property, it's like for me, for example, November 15th. I'm like, that's when the rut's going to fire up, and it's
Mm-hmm.
always the same. And that's regardless to your point of like moon phase doesn't affect it,
Mm-hmm.
temperature doesn't affect it. This is when the rut starts in this area, and it's the
Yep.
same every year. And even mapping application like Hunt Stand, they have like a rut indicator map that you just get with their subscription, and it tells you like
Yeah.
based off of reporting like of hunters observations, this is when the rut should start here.
Yeah.
So that is true.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we
Yeah.
agree on that.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
We agree on
Well,
that.
damn it,
Another.
I hate going. I don't want to go. Like we base our I do a lot of archery elk hunting. Well, once
Yeah.
I go for a week every year, and we base that on the moon phase. Like I don't want to go when there's a new moon because I believe the bulls are like breeding or chasing or doing whatever it is they're doing
Mm-hmm.
all night long, and you don't see as much daytime activity. And
Well, you
maybe
know what?
that's
You're going to see a lot more deer or elk when you're in the woods hunting them than when you're at home waiting for the right time. I
That's
guarantee
true.
you,
That's
you'll
true.
see more deer or more elk when you're out in the woods.
Yeah.
Guaranteed.
Yeah, I know you can't kill them from the couch. The old
Yeah.
saying. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yep.
Uh,
Um,
but
look,
another thing, one of the interesting things we learned, and I'm sorry if we're going to probably run over time here. But I love talking about
we
this
don't.
stuff.
I don't have a hard stop, so we can go as long as you have
Okay,
availability.
a lot of hunters on open properties report, you know, I hadn't seen a buck, and all of a sudden he showed up on my property in middle of October, and he was there for the season, and then he left again. I didn't see him again until the next October or late September. He showed up again. What's going on? And we didn't have really good information to answer that question until some of our recent buck movement studies. And we documented right about 1/3 of the adult bucks are have different personalities than the other 2/3. And the personality, is a term I think that describes uh, these two types of behavior. I like to call them the mobile buck and the sedentary buck. The sedentary bucks are what we traditionally think of as, a buck's going to live on 1,000 acres, and he's going to make, what biologists call exploratory sallies or an excursion. They'll
Hmm.
leave their home range for a day or two or three, go a mile or two away, and come back. And they'll do, these exploratory excursions throughout the season and also other times of the year. But oftentimes it's during the hunting season, breeding season. And we think, well,
Yeah.
they're out looking for a doe. Well, that's the sedentary lifestyle, 1,000 acres excursions. We identified 1/3 of our bucks were mobile personality. They actually lived in 2 or more places. On average, and this was over 60 bucks. And so 1/3, say 20 of those bucks, on average, lived 2 different home ranges
Hmm.
4 miles apart from each other.
Wow. Huh.
Uh, and some of them were very much like clockwork. We had a buck that we captured him in middle of August. The next day, he left the study area. This was a 55,000 acre study area. So he left, and he ended up
Wow.
being 13 miles away, Cable. And he spent 6 months over there. We thought, well, goodness, he doesn't like us. We must have really
Yeah.
pissed him off when we put that collar on him. 6 months later, in February, he comes back. And oh, great, he got over it. Well, the next August, heads out again and goes to the same property 13 miles away, spends 6 months, and comes back in February.
Incredible. Huh.
Yeah. And we thought that was like the super buck for mobility. We had a buck down in the near Vicksburg, which is if you're familiar with the delta, what they call the Delta region in Mississippi, the
Hmm.
floodplain of the Mississippi River, just north of Vicksburg. We collared this buck. I think he was two or
Civil War
three.
battle site, right?
Yeah. Vicksburg is
Yeah.
big battle. Um, that buck we captured um, north of Vicksburg, and the next August he left, swam the Mississippi River, which is over a mile across, and spent the summer in Louisiana hanging out in some soybean fields. The
Hmm.
following, when was it? No, I misquoted there. He left in February and swam to Louisiana and hung out in the soybean fields. The following August, he swam back to Mississippi and spent the hunting season in Mississippi. Thought, wow, this
Well, that's
is
because those Cajuns, if it's brown, it's down, right? He doesn't want to be there for that.
that was kind of my joke response. And you know what he did the next year in those same
Huh.
time frames? He
Huh.
swam the river again, spent the summer in Louisiana, and then came back for the safety of Mississippi hunting.
Huh. That's
27
incredible. But
miles.
I wonder, 27 miles away.
Yes. And swam
Wow.
the Mississippi River.
So that brings up this question: when these bucks go out, because originally they're gonna they're gonna go exploring, and they're going to find a new home range that may be their second home range. They just wait. They just go until they say this is the spot. I guess like here's the soybeans. This is where I want to be. But what told that buck to swim the river? Like I got to
Yeah.
find greener pastures somewhere. Like
Yeah. I wish I
and
had his.
why only a select few, a very small percentage of deer have these second home ranges that could be 10 or more miles away.
Mhm.
They're all
I,
wired different.
yeah, I would have loved to have known how he learned that. Did he learn that from his mother, who
Mm.
also swam the river and swam it with him as a 6-month-old fawn going across the river?
Mm-hmm.
We don't know. Um, but I think, there's that's happening for sure. We documented it. Third of the bucks are mobile, and I think it relates to what we might call deep time genetics adaptations to uh, there's risky behavior and there's non-risky behavior. And think of just, like humans, all the centuries of human history that's documented. There are risk takers, and there are most of us aren't high risk takers. If you look at all the people that the European descent people that moved west, they were risk takers. They wanted to find something better, and
Mm-hmm.
thank goodness they did. There's
Mm-hmm.
risk takers in deer. Now, whenever you're moving a lot through not your normal territory, you have a greater risk of dying. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's greater risk of movers, but maybe there's rewards in some circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
For example, back in the early 80s, when I was working in South Texas on the Piloncillo Ranch with my friend and fellow biologist Bob Zaglin, uh, we collared bucks on that ranch. And we had one buck in particular that was, I think we had him on the air for 4 years. We caught him in, well, let's just not worry about the year. We caught him as an estimate 5-year-old buck, and he was a 150 class buck, and wow, nice deer.
Mm-hmm.
That was the third year of a 3-year drought. It was tough times for the bucks, and then right after we caught him, it started raining. But before it got raining, he moved. One of his movements was over to an area about a mile away from where we caught him. And he went there that first fall and came back. And then it started raining. He never went there again for 3 years because it rained above average for 3 years. He had a very, very small home range. The fourth year, it got dry again. And guess where he went?
Mm.
Back over where there was actually a semi-permanent pond. So he knew where there was a pond when it was dry because of the risk taking. So there's
Mm.
benefit in moving out and finding things. So
Mm.
the way I think about it is there has to be some adaptation, some adaptive benefit to the population of deer to have a third of the bucks taking risks. There's also safety in numbers. 2/3 don't take the risks, but they'll benefit from the generally non-risky resources that are relatively stable.
Mm. Mm.
Now, you're familiar with the North and the cold
Mm-hmm.
winters.
Oh
You've
yeah.
probably heard about deer yards. Deer in Canada and the northern United States, they move into deer yards, a high percentage of them during the wintertime. It's coniferous, pines and spruce and evergreen trees that provide protection from the cold weather, and they get in there and they're protected from the extreme cold and the heavy snow. Crappy food. They
Mm.
really have a hard time making it nutritionally, but a percentage of them do that. It's a migratory behavior. Then they come out, and in the spring they head back to where they summer. Your
Mm-hmm.
elk in the west that you hunt, they're migratory. Most of them. Mule deer in the northwest are migratory. They have a
Oh
reason
yeah.
to go somewhere and then come back. And so I think this type of movement is ingrained in deer that there's benefit in going places and coming back.
Mhm.
So
Well, and
that's
as
my
hunters,
ecology.
you know, we can pick up on that too. Like my buddy Tarif, he killed a 194 in Grayson County this year, and had a tine broken off. Would have been over 200 inches. Shot it with his bow. That buck did not live on his property. It showed up. I think it was late November last year,
Hmm.
and he was like, "I'm not." He passed on 170s leading up because like I know that deer's going to come back. Oh, I hope he
Uh,
comes back, right?
yeah, yeah.
And it was within 2 days from when he was showed up the year before. That deer was there. The next day he killed him,
Bingo.
and so it was just like clockwork. And he did know like he after he killed him, he found out from another neighbor like it was like 2 miles away where the deer was actually living.
Hmm.
But then he made his excursion for whatever
Hmm.
reason, whether it was does or food or whatever. And
Yep.
there he was, just like clockwork. And there was Tarif waiting. And you talk about passing up. He showed me pictures of 170. He passed up. He's like, but he thought he was going to be a 200-inch buck too. And he was scouring that property looking for that busted off tine because the first picture he got when he showed back up, he had it. And then he got in a
uh,
fight and he lost it. And he didn't know
oh
when he
yeah.
shot him. Like, but
Uh, I
yeah,
bet he would have shot him anyway.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
I did want to ask you one other question.
Okay.
Um, I killed a buck in South Texas in around Freer, probably 12, 13 years ago. And this was on my buddy's 4,000 acre low fence lease. And it had orange ear tags, but he told me, he's like, there's a nice buck here. You know, he'll be the one with the ear tags. I was like, okay, cool. It was the biggest deer I'd ever seen. I had just really started to get into deer hunting at the time. He walks out, bang, I shoot him in the Sendero. And then I was intrigued. I was like, why does he have ear tags? Well, found out the neighboring ranch was doing a age structure survey. And it was Dr. Deer, it was James Kroll who was doing the research. And I had already been doing interviews with James at the time, like a quarterly discussion on whitetail management, behavior, all that stuff. And he said, so send me the picture of your buck. And he was 142-inch 10 point, and it was a drought year. And he goes, okay, I'll find a picture of him as a yearling. And he sends me back this picture of this crappy spike that was the most pathetic excuse for a whitetail buck. I mean, like an inch little nubs. And so I was going to ask you, like, I know my own personal experience. And so this bucket, he was 4.5 when I shot him, 142 inches. He was a disgusting little pathetic spike at 1.5. What is your take on shooting spikes? I know it's a
It,
loaded
it abs-
question.
no, no, I've gotten it many times, and I have a very strongly opinionated just input for you. It totally depends. It
Uh-huh.
depends on a lot of factors. We wrote a publication, Bronson Strickland and I, an extension publication a number of years ago, using antler criteria as a guide to harvesting bucks. Uh, and in there, we talk about, well, should you shoot spikes? And it just depends on a lot of the context of your property. Is free range, controlled? Is it a dry year or wet year? What's the cohort that that buck represents? What were they born under? If that tiny spike yearling might have been born in a drought year and he was stunted,
Mm.
and if it starts raining, he can catch up and compensate, because it wasn't a genetic limitation in him. It was the environment at the time he was produced that restricted that expression of his antlers as a yearling.
Mm.
So if you don't have extreme environmental variation, you can categorize antler development as young as 1.5 years of age, and generally say, well, this is going to be a below average buck and this is going to be above average buck. We've done studies in Mississippi where it's a much more stable environment. We don't have the extreme drought that Texas does, but in our studies, in our research pens, and also in our field studies, if you take a set of yearling bucks, 30 of them, and you classify them from smallest to largest antlers as yearlings. Take the lower 10, the middle 10, and the upper 10. When they're out at 4 and 5 years of age, the lower 10 will, on average, be smaller, significantly smaller than the upper 10.
Mm.
And then that
Okay.
middle 10 is probably going to be closer to the upper 10, but it's not going to be as high up. So there is genetic potential that is expressed at a yearling age, but it's totally confounded in some circumstances by the environment under which it was produced.
Mm-hmm.
Was
Yeah.
it a late born fawn because the doe, didn't
Yeah, you
conceive?
mentioned that 28
Yeah,
days later she goes back into estrus if she didn't take.
yeah.
So,
So
and
that
that
fawn,
can,
if that fawn was born a month later, and under less than ideal circumstances, it could be stunted.
mhm.
And even in our research pens, late
but
born
but
bucks tended to take 3 years to catch up to the early born bucks.
but in his genetic DNA, he will catch up if he's born, if he's got those genes. Being stunted isn't going to keep hold him back for his entire life. So then it's like, is it worth the risk of shooting a spike? Because you don't know what he's going to turn into.
So you never know. But in the study I quoted you, and this was based on research pens with unlimited resources for the deer
Uh-huh.
and in the wild, free range natural habitat.
Yeah.
In both sets of circumstances, the lower third on average were 20 inches smaller at
Huh.
maturity of gross Boone and Crockett, 20 inches less
Smoke
than
them
the
all.
upper
Shoot
third.
them.
No, it depends. It depends.
Yeah.
If you're not having bucks protected to 4 and 5 years of age, it probably doesn't matter. If you're just shooting 2 and 3 year old bucks, you just want a lot of bucks to shoot, then don't be
Uh-huh.
shooting culling, yearling age bucks because you just want them to get 2 to 3, and they're going to be bigger antlered than they were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But if you're in an area where overpopulation is a problem, and that's not as much of a problem in South Texas because you have this drought thing happening regularly that some years you don't have any fawn crop. So it's
Yeah.
naturally regulated by what we call density independent factors like rainfall and drought.
Mm-hmm.
In much of the areas in the U.S., that's not the case. In Mississippi, we typically have 30 to 60, 70% fawn crops every year.
Huh.
So we're having to control the doe population aggressively, and oftentimes we're wanting to control the buck population. And if you're targeting mature, larger antlered deer as a goal of management, then it's not unreasonable to shoot younger aged, smaller antlered bucks. Yearling, properties I've worked with as a management consultant in those areas, I would have them targeting spikes less than 4 inches. Uh,
Mm.
2 year old bucks that have 4 or fewer points. 3 year old bucks that are 6 or fewer points, because within the range of variation for that cohort on the property, that lower third on average is going to be a good group to remove as part of population control.
Mm-hmm.
Does
Mm-hmm.
that guarantee that you're going to have everything's perfect? No, absolutely
No.
not. But you can't be perfect in management. We don't manage individual deer in a
Right.
population. We have to, all right, generally, this is what we want to do, and go do it. And if it's based on data and makes sense within the context of that property, then it's a viable option.
Well,
But
you made a good point
absolutely,
there, which
it's very easy to misunderstand this point. I want to reiterate, I'm not saying shoot every spike.
right.
There are areas in Mississippi that had 70 to 80% of their yearling bucks were spikes. The worst thing you could do is say, shoot all the spikes, because then you've
Right.
eliminated an age class.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
it all depends on the context, Cable.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, and there's two things I wanted to say. Number one, this is a totally different conversation, but you made a good point. You said we don't manage based off of the individual deer. And I have that argument every time I see whether it's the feds or a state or whatever saying, "Hey, we want to introduce legislation that would make traditional lead ammunition illegal because a bear is ingesting fragments from your gutted elk in the field and it maybe dies of lead poisoning. It's like, okay, we don't manage based off of that one bear. And I don't think that bear's dying anyway because the amount of lead it would have to ingest would be, it'd have to be so many different elk. Like, it's a stupid argument, but everyone's like, what about that one animal? And I'm like, well, that's just collateral damage. And it sounds terrible to say, but we're not managing for the one bear. We're managing for the entire population of everything. But I think
Well,
that's the one animal tugs at their emotional heartstrings. And it's like, okay, well, fine. California condors were really suffering because of that. So we made laws to
mhm,
prevent that. You show
mhm.
me the science that says black bear populations are now in danger because of traditional lead ammunition, and I'll say, okay, then let's have that conversation. But there is no science, and
Yeah.
so to me, it's the conversation ends right there. It's it's
Yeah.
virtue
I don't,
signaling.
I'm not a bear biologist, so I'm not into the data. I
I'm
don't know
just
what
using
lead
bear as an
levels are.
example. Yeah,
I don't know what levels are in bears, but
but
yeah, there are cases like you quote the California condor that was absolutely being devastated by scavenging on lead bullets in gut piles. So changing it, my opinion is if you've got some species that are of interest, and maybe it's not a species of interest to the deer hunter, but if it's of interest to a large percentage of the population of people, then we as hunters need to get behind the management of that, whatever that species is. You
sure,
know, yeah, it's more expensive to buy a non-lead bullet, but jeepers, how much money are we spending on our sport anyway? So
sure,
spend a little more to help, and because we want them, those people that don't hunt, we want them to support us in our hunting. We don't we need them to help us. The
hmm,
non-hunters, as long as they're not anti-hunters are never going to support hunters. But 80% of the population in the US aren't anti-hunting and they're not hunters.
right,
They're but 80% of those people, if they vote one way or the other, for or against hunting or whatever, then that's impactful. So
sure, sure.
we have to be sensitive, is what I'm saying.
I agree, but you got to show me some scientific data to be like, okay. I'm all about the
Yeah,
science. Like whatever the
yeah,
science says, that's how I want to manage wildlife, not with
yeah.
emotions. But yes, we do need to be sensitive to that 80%, like you said, that don't hunt
Mm-hmm.
and aren't anti-hunters, because there's what 6% of the population hunts. That leaves, whatever percentage is completely thinks our behavior is abhorrent, and that's the 80% that really is like, I'm cool. Do you, man? Whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, yeah. Um. Okay. Uh, Going back to the spike thing though, I don't know where the line of demarcation is as far as how many acres you need to have to actually manage property. And I'm thinking like the average Texas deer hunter realistically has 200 acres. I don't know what a deer lease is and size is in Mississippi. Now you go to South Texas, you go to West Texas. I've got 3,600 acres I'm sharing with five other guys in Childress. Like
Mm-hmm.
you get on these bigger places, I think you can, manage, even though your deer might go over to the neighbor's place. But there's going to be a lot more deer that make that their home range and stay on your property.
Mm-hmm.
If you only
Mm-hmm.
have 200 acres, does it really matter if you shoot spikes or not?
No,
Realistically,
no. 1,000 acre on average home range for a buck. He's on your property sometimes, but
mm,
uh, it comes down to why are you shooting that buck differentially? If it's not a good reason from a management standpoint, from the biology standpoint, then don't do it.
mm,
Don't do it. Just let them grow older. Because from the standpoint, if you don't have a population control problem with your bucks, then absolutely don't shoot any bucks until they're what you want, or
mm,
until they get so really old and they're clearly not what you want. But then it's a management decision to shoot an old mature buck that's a 6 point.
mm.
The average buck cable on data I've seen in Texas and in Mississippi, the average buck at maturity is 8 points.
Right.
There's a reason the average buck is 8 points, because that's the most successful size for antlers. And we've
Mm,
done some analysis of the average width is about 15 inches. And we think that comes down to an effective fighting stance. Like,
Hmm.
if you look at wrestlers, like real wrestlers, college wrestlers, their stance is low and they have their hands like this close together. They're not out like this. So wide antlered bucks don't have an advantage in fighting another buck. There's an optimum fighting width of antlers, and it's about 15 inches.
Huh.
That's why the
Interesting.
average mature buck is 8 points and 15 inches.
And in Texas, I know that the average age of a buck that gets shot is 3.5, which, also, I don't know if at 4.5, maybe an 8 point turns into a 10 point in some situations. I don't know.
Well, yeah, some of them do.
Yeah.
But my average value is at maturity. They're 8 points, and I, depending upon the soil resource region, we have thousands of data points from the real soil resource regions in Mississippi, and I'm sure similar patterns occur in Texas. They have different percentages, and I could quote you, in the Delta, if I pulled up my data, I could tell you exactly what percentage are 10-point bucks or 9-point bucks or 11 or more point bucks at harvest in different soil regions.
Mm-hmm.
And back to your point about, if you don't have a need to selectively remove some smaller antlered younger bucks, you're just letting them all grow. Some of those, the buck that Dr. Kroll showed you that was a little short spike as the yearling, and you harvested a nice buck. There's our results from Mississippi, that lower third, middle third, upper third, that was the average buck. That didn't mean that every buck that was in that lower third stayed in the lower third. And this is
Yeah.
consistent for research in South Texas as well. There's a lot of jumping between categories of individual bucks. But back to the,
Mm-hmm.
the point, unless you have an ear tag and you're saying, oh, protect yellow 17, you can't manage individual bucks. You just have to look.
Right.
The hunter has to say, okay, how old is it? What antler size is it? And how is that relative to the cohort expectations for this property? Is it a deer we need to shoot or not? It's an
Yeah.
informed decision.
Well, so 4 of the guys off of my last lease, the family decided to sell the property. Grandma got to be in her 90s, and this is how things go. Grandkids want to sell it. They want to get paid. It's fine. No, we're not crying over spilled milk there. I'd want to keep it to hunt for myself and pass it on to my kids, but these people have no interest in hunting. It's fine.
Yeah.
Um, that was a 2-buck county where our management plan on that property was you can shoot a trophy and a call. And our criteria for a call was 7 points or less, 4.5 years old, just something basic. This new place we're going to, though, is a 1-buck county. So that takes away a management tool of shooting a call. So we're all like, well, cool. Then our kids or our cousin or our buddy or whatever is going to come and shoot the call. If, we're going to see what we have on camera first. Maybe we don't have a high enough deer population to be even shooting calls. But I did think, man, this kind of takes away a little bit of a management tool as far as shooting some of those lesser quality deer. And there's studies that say, well, it doesn't matter if you knock out the lesser quality deer. But what I do know is they compete for food.
Mm-hmm.
So, from that, like, okay, fine. Genetically, might not be able to grow bigger rack bucks by shooting culls, but I can give the bucks that I want on the property better nutrition by removing hooves on the ground.
Absolutely. I agree 100% with what you said. And I wanted to come back to that genetic topic. When we talk about culling smaller antlered deer within their cohort, within their age class, it is absolutely not genetic management. All it is the standing crop of the bucks that are on your property right now. And if there's a limit in the number of bucks that can live on your property due to nutrition, you need to manage the number of bucks, and managing to protecting the better, larger antlered younger bucks to let them grow into bigger antlered older bucks is a smart thing to do. But you're not managing genetics at all. There is absolutely no way to effectively change the genetic population, even with the most extreme selective harvest, because it messes things up biologically for the deer population. My colleagues down at Kingsville have done some long-term studies looking at extremely intensive selective harvests or
Uh-huh.
selection, uh, and uh, they can increase the cohort size, the size of the bucks when they get older, but genetically they have no impact on the population. And
Mm.
some years ago, a PhD student and I, uh, we did a modeling exercise and showed theoretically it's impossible on even 20,000 acres where you have perfect selection. You know what these antlers are going to be. You can perfectly select. You still can't impact genetics, the expression of genetics in the deer population. So we're
Mm-hmm.
not talking genetic management. We're talking about population management only.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a a very important fact that I think is overlooked. A lot of people think, well, if I shoot the dinks, I'm going to help my antler development, antler production over the long haul, and it's
Yeah.
just not reality.
Nope.
Yeah.
Nope. Think back to we were talking about the breeding success. An individual buck is going to maybe produce one or two fawns in his life. So
Mm-hmm.
protecting a buck, thinking, well, he's going to be my brood buck, it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Shooting a buck because I don't want him breeding, it's not going to matter. It's a drop in the rain, drop of rain in a bucket.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we are wrapping up, Dr. Demarais, I know you recently retired and you just recorded your last episode of the Deer University podcast, which I am familiar with. How long did you guys do that?
I think it was about 5 years.
Uh-huh.
Uh, that was led by Bronson Strickland, my dear friend and colleague. We were both deer nuts, and he was in the extension wildlife specialist role, and I was in the research and teaching, classroom teaching role at Mississippi State. And so we had a great partnership, and he led us on the educational outreach to landowners and hunters, and I taught the kids in the classrooms. And he said, "Well, we need to develop a website." I said, oh, "Okay," and then he said, "Well, we need to get on social media." I said, "What's that?" And then he said, "We need to do a podcast." I said, "Podcasts? I've heard of that they exist." Well, now for 5 years or so, we put out like one a month, and we appreciate the work you go into to do them more frequently. I'm amazed, uh, but we're so proud, Cable, with our it's science applied to management.
Hmm.
Uh, we've had over 1 million downloads of our episodes in with about 90 episodes.
Wow.
That
Yeah,
it,
that's
it
awesome.
blew our minds that many people were interested in learning about the science applied to management,
Mm.
the kind of
And you
things
guys
we've
are,
been talking about here
yeah,
today.
yeah. And you are passing the torch.
Yes,
So the podcast is going to continue to live on.
yes, the Deer University podcast will continue. uh, Monday, me and Bronson co-hosted our last podcast. I've been replaced by Dr. Eric Mitchell, and he's been replaced Dr. Jacob Dykes as for the extension wildlife position. So those two young guys will carry on for another 20, 25 years
Oh,
and and teach people new things.
uh-huh. And so what does retirement look like for you?
Grandkids. That's what brought me to Arlington, Texas. I've got grandkids in Dallas, and and when I left in 1997, one of my dear friends bought me a lifetime hunting license in Texas, and I hadn't
Oh,
used
wow.
it for 27 years. So I'm finally going to get to use it again,
So
or
you
use
moved to
it.
Arlington.
Yeah, I'm in Arlington now.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you're not far from me. I'm in McKinney. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right on. Yeah.
I looked at some houses up in McKinney actually, but
Uh-huh.
we don't need. This isn't a real estate podcast.
Right. Well, welcome back to Texas. Yeah.
Thank you. It's great, great to be back and back in a slightly different perspective world from deer management, but there are deer nuts everywhere, and exactly how they practice their passion varies a little bit.
Yeah,
But deer nut is a deer nut.
absolutely. Well, hey, I really appreciate your time and your life's work as a deer nut. Uh, what a great resource. And thank you so much for jumping on with us today. It was educational, and some of the things you said was like, wow, I had no idea, you know? So hopefully our audience learned as much as I did throughout the conversation. So certainly appreciate it.
My pleasure, Cable. I enjoyed the time.
Absolutely. Take care. Enjoy those grandkids.
Thank you.